Those two types of funding comes from the state, and those are restricted specifically for streets and roadway type projects. Arterials get some of that funding, and it's the same as a street fund, except it's focused more on the arterial type of roads instead of the local roads. We also have Paths and Trails, which is a small fund that gets some of that same funding, and it's focused on paths and trails. TBD is the Transportation Benefit District that was passed by the voters about 2 years ago. Those funds come from a 0.2% sales tax, and those funds are restricted for specific projects that are outlined on the Street Saver program. We have impact fees. We have transportation impact fees. We have parks impact fees, and those impact fees are restricted for growth-related roadway and park and recreation projects. We have creative arts. That gets its funding from 1/4% tax on 3 of our utilities. Those funds are restricted for arts projects and maintenance. We have the lodging tax, which is 0.2% out of the 6 used, following the rules regarding, having the LTAC committee. The city council provides a certain amount of funding for the LTAC committee to consider. We open a grant program, people apply, the LTAC committee considers it, and then provides recommendations to the city council, who then either adopts it or rejects it, and it goes back, and blah, blah, blah. So we do that once a year for those funds. And then finally, we have the Senior Services Fund. Their funding is from fees that they receive, donations, and also a transfer from the general fund. We have, go ahead.
On the parks impact fees?
Yes.
We can only use that for new parks, correct?
Growth. Yeah, we cannot use that for replacements. Yeah. Debt service, well, you can use it on existing parks if it's for like a new facility, like an expansion in an existing park.
New play structure?
Yes, yeah, things like that. But it can't just be for like replacing an existing structure or sod or something like that, unless there's no sod in here. But anyway, all right. Debt service funds. There's one debt service funds that is for our local loans for street lighting. It receives transfers from, and it's a small fund, it receives transfers from a few different areas to pay for that annual debt service. Then we have our capital projects funds. That's the last governmental fund. That is our real estate excise tax 1, which is 1/4% of the real estate transaction amount. And then REIT 2 is the second 1/4% of the real estate transaction amount. So the state gets more than that. That is the local amount that we get. We get 0.5% of a real estate transaction. The state gets anywhere between, I forgot the first one, but it goes up to like 1.28. It depends on the value of the property that's being sold. So the state gets the majority of the real estate excise tax that the seller pays. We get 0.5%.
Actually starts out at 1.2.
1.2?
It starts out at 1.2 and goes up from there.
I thought under 500,000 was below 1%, but it starts at 1.28. Okay, all right, whatever. So I can get you that information. So yes, that's that. And those funds are to be used, they can't be used for operating except in limited circumstances. Those funding can be used for capital projects such as streets, city facilities, parks, and so on. And there's slightly different rules between the two. And we do have a Windjammer Park Capital Project Fund. Most of our capital projects are in like general capital project funds, but that particular one, they created a special fund just for Windjammer Park. I'm not sure how many years ago, but it was before I was brought on board. Next, we have our enterprise funds. That's a proprietary type fund. That's like a business type enterprise, like a government business type enterprise funds. There's 5 of those: water, wastewater, solid waste, storm drain, and marina. And the definition of an enterprise fund is that the funding that's generated by user fees covers the cost of the expenses incurred by those particular funds. And the final one are internal service funds. We have equipment rental, equipment replacement. That's kind of a sinking fund for equipment. We have a sinking fund for facilities. We have a sinking fund for technology. And we also have the shop facility fund, where Public Works Operations is funded out of, and also labor pool charges are funded out of. The internal service funds get all their funds from other funds. So that's how they get funded, and their expenses are allocated out based on allocation methodologies per each one. All funds budget. So the adopted budget for 2021-22 for all the funds was $215.3 million. The general funds, which is the fund that's most talked about, comprises only about 18% of that amount. The enterprise funds I talked about, the 4 utilities and marina, that accounts for a little over half of that funding. Internal service funds, which just kind of redistributes money between all the funds, is about 16%. The special revenue funds is about 9%. That small debt service fund rounds down to 0. And our capital projects funds, which receives their funding from other funds, is about 5%. So the general fund operating budget. So looking at that general fund, about half of the operating budget is for public safety. Miscellaneous is the next largest category, that's 12%. That includes unencumbered fund balance, which I'll talk about a little bit later, and the stabilization reserve, which I'll also talk about a little bit later. That comprise, and there's a few other things in there as well, but those are the 2 main items that comprise that 12%. Parks is next at 8%. Development services and finance both are 6%. And also law and judicial is about 6%. And all the other departments, such as human resources and legislative and administration, general government, and so on, is the other 14%. The total for the general fund operating budget over the 2 years is $38.5 million. Another look at the general fund. It's really hard to see. Sorry about those colors. So personnel costs, salaries and benefits comprise 60% of general fund costs. Operating expenses comprise another 17% of those costs. Transfers out, which means transfers out to capital projects or transfers out for other purposes, is 8%. And those are transfers out to other funds, not outside, all the funds. And then capital expenses that are in the general fund, including that one fund I talked about, that's within the umbrella of general fund, those are about 4%. And again, just like the last pie chart, the unencumbered fund balance and stabilization reserve and a few other items comprises the 12% category there. So where does the money come from? Revenues and resources. So we have revenues. Revenues come from external sources such as taxes or user fees or intergovernmental revenues. And that determines the amount available for the services that the city provides. Resources, on the other hand, those include funds that are already in our bank accounts, basically, our fund balance, reserves that were set aside by policy or other purposes, and interfund transactions. So sources of revenue. So charges for goods and services is 64% of all the revenues that we receive. Fines and forfeitures rounds down to 0. Miscellaneous, which is rent, settlement, sales of assets, some interest income, that's about 2%. The next largest category are taxes at 25%. Then we also have intergovernmental payments at 8%, and then licenses and permits at 1%. And I'm going to go into each one of these in detail on the upcoming slides. Taxes. So that previous pie chart showed that 25% of all of our revenues is taxes, and that 25% is shown right here on the slide. You have property taxes, which is 34%, sales taxes 37%, utility taxes is 21%, and then 3 other taxes, which adds up to about 8%. So property tax. This is the city's largest source of general fund revenue and the third largest source of revenue overall. Over the 2 years in the biennial, the property tax was budgeted at $9.3 million. So how property tax works. So unlike most other states, property taxes in Washington are budget-based. And that's a quote from the MRSC Revenue Guide, which I do encourage folks to download and read at your leisure. But I found that, I talked to Blaine, I think Wisconsin has a similar setup as Washington, but in other states I've worked, it works a little bit differently. So it works as in the city council adopts the levy rate, and then that's multiplied by the assessed value, and then you get your taxes. In Washington state, it's not like that. It's based on the budget. So it's based on how much revenue did you raise in the last year of property taxes, and what are we adding to that? And the maximum you can add is that 1%, which I'll get into in the next few slides. Taxing jurisdictions in Washington, the established dollar amount of property taxes. Then the county assessors calculate the levy rates based on the county property assessment process. And the formula is the assessed value from the county multiplied by the levy rate equals the levy amount. So if the city decides the levy amount and the county decides the assessed value, the levy rate is the unknown. And that is calculated by the other two agency processes. So the Washington State Constitution limits property taxes to $10 per every $1,000 of assessed value, or what is commonly called 10 mills. There are exceptions. Excess levies and voter-approved debt are the two exceptions. There's a further limit of $5.90 for local governments, with some exceptions. And of that $5.90 for local governments, there's a further limit of $3.60 for most cities. So here's the formula. And I multiplied the assessed valuation, which you see in the second column from the left, by the rate to get the amount of the property tax levy that the city of Oak Harbor has brought in each one of those years. And as you can see, it goes up slowly over time. In 2010 to 2011, it did drop, and that was a combination of the Great Recession, and also there was some kind of bond that expired at that time. There was a bond levy that expired at that time. I'm not 100% sure what it was for, but it did expire between those 2 years. That's hard to read. So how property taxes work. I talked about the 10 mil levy limit. You can see that on the bottom of that chart, the state gets up to $3.60 of that $10 limit. Local districts get the $5.90, which I mentioned the cities are limited to $3.60 of that $5.90. And there's an additional 50 cents for EMS levies, affordable housing levies, and a few other things on there. So the statutory maximum levy, this is something you'll hear every November when we bring that item forward to City Council for the property tax rate. So like I said, out of the 590 available local districts, the maximum levy rate for cities is $3.60. For Oak Harbor, that's reduced. The Snow Isle Regional Library levy rate is deducted from that amount. It's currently at 0.3915, so that leaves our maximum levy at 3.2085. And the library's statutory maximum is 0.5. They're currently at 0.39, but they could go up to 0.5 with a levy lid lift if they put it out to the voters. So the 2022 Oak Harbor levy rate is $1.82823, which would raise that $4.6 million I showed in the chart. Our statutory maximum rate, which is 3.2085, would raise $8.1 million. So how property taxes work specifically in Island County. there are 9 taxing jurisdictions that request levies for Oak Harbor residents. In different parts of Island County, there might be different jurisdictions, but for Oak Harbor residents, there's 9 jurisdictions that are on the tax bill. Those levies are divided by the assessed valuation as determined by the county assessor, and the property tax rate results. And that property tax rate is applied to every $1,000 of assessed value on your property. And for people in Oak Harbor, the overall 2022 rate is $10.71 per $1,000 of assessed value. And as I mentioned, for the city of Oak Harbor, it's $1.82 per thousand. So here's your breakdown for 2022 with an average assessed value of $331,000, which of course you can probably sell a house for more than that, but that's what the property assessor is saying the average assessed value is. Oak Harbor gets 17% of your tax bill, or out of your average $3,550 tax bill, the portion that goes to the city of Oak Harbor is $604. Schools, together with the state schools in the local district, that looks like about 60%, a little bit over 60% goes to schools. The county itself gets 8%, the library gets 4%, hospitals 7%, the Parks District gets 2%, and the Conservation Futures and Cemetery round down to 0. What this looks like as far as the millage rate, the total millage rate is 10.707. There's some excess levies in there that's bringing it over 10. That's what it looks like as far as your levy rates. And this is what it looks like as far as the dollars. So the total average tax bill is $3,550. See, the school district gets $1,200. State schools gets about $1,000. City gets about $600. Island County gets $300. And then you can kind of go down the list to see what all the other jurisdictions get. Yeah. Haven't heard a whole lot of complaining out of them. But anyway, sorry. So this gets a little complicated, but I put all this on one slide to help folks understand this. So this, you'll notice over time, especially on that chart I showed about 5 slides ago, that the levy rate tends to go down over time. Why does that happen? Well, there's 3 components, like I mentioned before. The first component here is assessed valuation. Going back to 2009, you can see that the assessed valuation started dipping during the Great Recession. It reached its dearth over in 2014 and then started going up until where you see it today at about $2.5 billion. Next slide is your levy rate. 2009, it was about 2.1 or so. It went up and then it started coming down and to where it is today at 1.82. And the amount that's being brought in, you can see that it was about $4 million in 2009. It took that big dip in 11 because of that expiring bond levy and also the Great Recession, and then it started creeping up slowly. The average over all those years, even with new construction, which is added on top of the formula, was only 1% a year. So what I did, because one of those charts was in billions, another was in millions, and another was in dollars, I reset everything in 2009 to 1. And then I compared each year to that first year to show what those 3 look like on one chart. So the top line is the levy rate. The bottom line is the valuation from the county. You can see how as the evaluation goes down, the levy rate goes up. And the middle line is the amount of the levy, and you can see that that slowly goes up over time. And eventually, you'll notice that as the assessed valuation starts creeping back up, the levy rate starts coming down. And that's just what happens in Washington State when it comes to levy rates. So there are some methods of increasing property taxes. You have that 1% annual levy limit, which can be approved by a vote of the city council. You have levy lid lifts, and you also have excess levies. So the 1% annual levy limit that was put in place in the state of Washington in 2007 by that RCW you see up there, it applies to all city levies except for excess levies and voter-approved debt. Now that limit is reduced in the years, this implicit price deflator is less than 1%. So you'll see where it's red on that chart, those 4 years where it's red, that was where this implicit price deflator measure of inflation the state uses was less than 1%. And in order to go up to the 1%, a city would have to adopt a second resolution, finding of substantial need resolution, which the city has done every year that's happened those 4 years. So just to compare the amount that we bring in to the inflation measures, the bottom gray bar is the amount that Oak Harbor has brought in through property taxes, with one being set in 2009 and every year compared to that first year. You can see that after 12 or 13 years, it's only 12% higher than it was in 2009. However, inflation, and this doesn't include the crazy inflation that just occurred, this is 2021, and that's where I cut it off. You can see that the CPI increase was 31% over that time, and this implicit price deflator was 27% over that time. So the amount of property tax revenues being brought in was approximately 1/3 of those two measures of inflation. So I put some counterfactual scenarios together. What would have happened if the levy amount was not increased to the 1%, but kept flat over those 13 years? And you can see that the first year it's kept flat in 2010. It would have been a reduction in property tax revenue of $68,000. And then every year you can see it compounding and compounding and compounding to, you'll notice over those 12 years, it would have been a reduction in property tax revenue of $4.1 million. Another counterfactual was, what if we didn't do the substantial need resolution? We just said, it's not 1%, it's at 0.2. We're going to keep it at 0.2. We're not going to do 1%. So those years in red are those years where it was under the 1%. And if you add up all those times over 12 years, it would have been a total of $1.2 million less in property taxes. So levy lid lifts. These, and this is good information to have as we're talking about these kind of things with the new fire station. The levy lid lifts, they allow cities to exceed that 1% annual levy lid. A 50% plus one vote of the electorate is required, and there's different flavors of levy lid lifts. You have the single year levy lid lift or the multi-year one. The single year is just one and done. You ask the voters to increase it, they vote to increase it by whatever they increase it by, and you're done. You don't go back to the voters, it just stays that way. Or you have a multi-year one where sometimes a city might come in and ask for, the voters to go, increase it by 0.2, and then increase it by another 0.2, and then another 0.2, and then when they're done, keep it there at the top one. That's not as common, but that's also an option. You can raise it every year for 6 years. You have an option to make it permanent, so it's ongoing, to pay for ongoing costs. Or you can make it temporary. You can have an expiration date on your levy lid lift. So if you do a single year, it can be for any governmental purpose, but you can, in the ballot language, limit it to, for example, a fire station or public safety needs. If you do a multi-year, you have to put the limited purpose in the ballot language. Now, a single year levy lid lift can go in any election, special election, primary, general election. The multi-year can only go on a primary or general election. And if a levied lid lift is used for debt, the levied lid lifts may not exceed 9 years. It must expire. The most common one, and this is from the MRSC guide, the most common one used is the single year permanent levied lid lift for a specific purpose. So this is a graphical representation of what that looks like. The single year permanent, in that third year in that bar, the voters increased the levy by a certain amount, and it just stays that way permanently. So as property taxes go up by the 1% or 1% plus construction, that also goes up by that amount. This is a temporary one where the voters decided to only have it for 5 years. So it goes up, it stays that way for 5 years, and then it goes away, and then taxes would go back to the point where they would have been if it never happened. On the multi-year permanent, you can see that it's stepping up over time, and by the 5th year, they're done stepping it up, and they just, it's permanent, so it just stays as part of the levy. And the final one is a temporary multi-year one, so it steps up every year, and by the last year, it just goes away, and the taxes go back to what they would have been if nothing happened. The final way to raise property taxes is an excess levy for general obligation bonds. There is an excess levy for another specific purpose. It doesn't really apply to the city, but there is another way to raise property taxes for other agencies using an excess levy. But for cities, an excess levy for general obligation bonds, this permits an increase over that statutory maximum rate that I talked about earlier, that 3.2 for the city of Oak Harbor. A supermajority voter approval is required, that's 60% plus one, plus validation, which I'll go into in a few slides. It's designed for the purpose of paying back long-term capital debt. It's seen as very secure by bond markets, which may lead to better interest rates. It can only be used for new capital projects and new vehicles. It cannot be used for replacements. It provides a stable revenue stream that's automatically sized each year to the exact amount of the debt service. And once the debt's been repaid after 20 years or 25 years or however long the bond is, it goes away. And that vote can be placed on any election, special, primary, or general election. Validation, another slide that's hard to read. So validation means that at least 40% voter turnout compared to the most recent general election must happen. So if the last general election you had 1,000 people turn out, you must have at least 400 people turn out on the election for the excess levy. If 400 people don't turn out, it fails. Even if everybody votes, even if every one of those 400 people, if every one of those 399 people vote, yes, we want the excess levy, it fails because it did not meet the condition of the 40%. So that's basically how validation works. There's a few scenarios that I'm really having trouble reading, but basically, once you get to the validation, you still need to get 60% of the turnout in order to pass the excess levy, or for the voters to pass the excess levy. I went back and took a look at our general election turnouts over the past 8 or 9 years to see if we would have any trouble with validation in the future. Can't predict the future, but I can tell you that I believe, you can see right there in the total voted column, that the November 2020 general election was a very high turnout election. 10,019 people voted out of the total registered voters of 13,000 and change. So the very next election, there was a special election, I think, in 21, I forgot what it was for, but it was a special election. It wasn't anything for the city, but I looked at the city's voters. Only in the city, how many city voters turned out for that special election, and it ended up, it was 42.7% of the voters who turned out for the general election. So even in that super high turnout general election, we would have had validation the very next year when the turnout was much lower. So, property tax myths. When my assessed value increases, the city automatically gets more revenue. Not necessarily. It really depends on a bunch of different factors. If your assessed value went up 2%, but everybody else's assessed value on the average went up 6%, and the city only increased by 1%, you might actually end up with a lower tax bill. It's possible. If the city raises my property taxes 1%, then everything will go up by 1%. Not necessarily, depends on the assessed value. The city determines the tax rate. It's like that in California, it's like that in Florida, a lot of places it's like that. It's not like that here. And while it's true in other states, Washington is pretty unique when it comes to property tax laws. Property tax truths. The city determines its levy, its total revenue it needs to balance the budget. That includes the current levy, plus allowances for new construction, and the tax is allowed to go up to the lesser of the 1% or the implicit price deflator. Of course, if a resolution of substantial needs passed, then you can go up to the 1% in those years where this measure of inflation is not 1%. The assessor determines your property values and rate results from the math. Who wants to do sales taxes? I don't know.
You're doing good, David.
All right. Are we all awake? All right. All right, here we go. Well, are there any questions on property taxes before? And this is it. There's a lot of revenues. I went into super detail, but that's part of primer part 2. So are there any questions on property taxes before we move on to sales taxes? All right, sales taxes. So this is the city's second largest source of general fund revenue and the second largest source of revenue overall. $10.3 million in 2021 and 22. So sales taxes, the uses for the sales taxes are the general sales tax, which goes into the general fund, the transportation benefit district sales tax, and the criminal justice sales tax. And you can see from that chart, 80% or so of sales taxes, of all the sales taxes that come in are the general sales tax. The TBD is about 16%, and whatever, 5. Man, I got to get glasses or something.
You got glasses.
I got to get better glasses. How sales tax work? Collected as a percentage of sales. So on clothing, on household goods, and automobiles, restaurants, other retail sales. And the destination of the sales determines who gets the revenues, with some exceptions. It used to be for online sales, if you happen to have the Amazon warehouse and it was shipped from there, that jurisdiction would get all the money. They changed that law in a lot of states. I think Washington did it about 4 years ago to ensure that wherever it was delivered to, that destination, that city or county or wherever it gets delivered to, they would benefit from that sales tax because they are the ones who are truly providing the service to that customer. The government services to the customer.
Can I ask a question right here
Oh, yeah.
on sales tax? So if we buy stuff, let's say from Seagraves Manufacturing, do we get the sales tax revenue here for what we bought in Wisconsin on a fire engine that's going to come here?
That's a great question.
Well, I thought it was.
I would say the destination is here, right? They're a manufacturer, right?
Right.
And they're shipping it here. I would say we get it.
Okay.
Because you know what? On the clean water facility, a lot of the stuff we did, we ended up getting a bump in sales taxes during that time. I look back in the data. So yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Yes. So issues affecting sales taxes. Economic conditions, state mandates and initiatives, local land use decisions, and economic development efforts. So economic conditions, recessions, Fed does something, the economy changes, that can affect how much money people have to spend, tourism, and so on. State mandates and initiatives. States always coming out with great ideas that affect cities. That can change the amount, increase or decrease the amount of sales taxes we get. Local land use decisions as well. Are we approving residential? Are we approving commercial? What are the kind of things developers are building in our cities? And also economic development efforts. Where sales tax goes. So I broke down where that 8.9% of your sales tax goes. I think it's now 9% based on the county's vote a few weeks ago. But this chart was done, a few months ago, so it shows the 8.9%. The majority of that 8.9%, about 6.5%, goes to the state of Washington. The county. First and second sales taxes, it's 1%. However, we do split it with the county and the state, so we get 0.842%. That's our take. The transportation benefit district, that's a 2% on the sales tax. We get the vast majority of that. No split with the county. A small amount goes to the state for administrative purposes. And the county, there's a criminal justice tax out there for the county. That's 0.1%. That's allocated out between the county and city and state by formula. Island Transit gets 0.9%. There's a mental health tax. The county gets most of that. And the juvenile facility, the county gets most of that. So out of the 8.9%, the city keeps just a touch over 1%. The county keeps 1.3%, and the state keeps a touch over 6.5%. General sales tax. So I talked about the first half and the second half. That's per statutes. Over time, there was, the state allowed cities to do 0.5, and I guess later they allowed another 0.5 for a full percent. The way that works is 1% off the top of that goes right to the state, and the remainder split 85% to Oak Harbor, 15% to Island County. It's collected based on sales in Oak Harbor, and the revenue is used to fund general fund services. That's $8.7 million over the biennial. TBD, 0.2%. 1% goes to the state, 99% of that goes to Oak Harbor. Voters approved that in November. Collection started in November of 19. Collection started in 2020. That's based on sales within Oak Harbor. Revenues used for transportation improvement projects identified in the city's 6-year capital improvement plan, and also it's able to be used on that Street Saver pavement management system, which engineering updates the county about twice a year, and we do an annual report on the TBD once a year. That's $1.6 million over those 2 years. Keep in mind that that first year was an abridged year. I believe in 2023-24, it'll be closer to $2 million. Criminal justice sales tax, 0.1%. 1% goes to the state, 90% to Oak Harbor, and 10% to Island County, collected based on sales within Island County, and that's distributed by the county based on a formula, population and crime rates, and that supports criminal justice budgets. That's about $568,000 over those 2 years. Available sales tax is not enacted. There is an available public safety sales tax that has not been enacted here. I think the state allowed this a couple of years ago. I believe Kirkland did adopt this. Cities can go up to 0.1%, and the county can go up to 0.3%. That's a sales tax. There is a revenue sharing component. If the city passes it, they get most of it. If the county passes it, there's a population formula. We get about 35% of the amount the county passes. There's also a cultural access one available. Not a whole lot of places have passed that. And there's one that the county just approved. Voter approval is not required for this one. It was the housing and related services that the county passed. And there's some other ones possible too in the MRC guide that are pretty uncommon. So that ends primer part 1.
I just want to say that wasn't too terribly taxing.
But the suspense to the lead up to that.
So third time was a charm, David. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Are there any questions? All right.
All right, you can do closing. You got closing.
So we are coming to our close. We are just 1 minute behind. Hopefully you got a lot out of today. There are a lot of deliverables that are come from this. You'll get a retreat report, some draft council staff communication guidelines. You'll get a draft council goals. That's about it. So there's a lot. And there's a lot of strategies and items that you identify to improve your meetings, so we'll make sure Blaine gets that. Yeah. You guys are awesome. You did a wonderful job. You followed all the ground rules. Anyone have any last words of wisdom? Good with the order? Thank you. Oh,
Thank you, Julie. You did a good job.
our attorney for coming too.
Yeah.
She's a real person.
Thought you liked that. Okay. So back to Mayor Pro Tem Poor to wrap us up.
Okay. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for your time. Thank you for being honest. And let's remember, we're going to be honest henceforth. Thank you very much. And we're adjourned.